looking at the legal underpinnings of money, and we encourage people to come to those next fall. And please stay tuned for further announcements. And thank you. Enjoy.
Good evening. Someone once said that economics is a lot like summer in New York in the 1970s. There's a lot of heat, not enough power, and everybody wants to escape from it. Apparently a few of you disagree, and so we're grateful that you showed up rather than attempting to escape. So to begin with, I just wanted to ask, are all economists bonkers? It's a question we face in tonight's debate. We come to you tonight from Columbia University in New York City's Upper West Side. And people have been asking here for a long time, are economists crazy? The definition of crazy is getting one result, doing the same thing, and then over and over and over again. Economists seem to offer plans to improve economic conditions, and yet economic conditions do not improve, and yet they still have their plans to improve things. We have before us two unconventional economic thinkers who will offer up their differing answer to the question, what can be done to improve the current state of economic affairs? Notice that the question is odd because it assumes what is not in evidence, that conditions can be improved rather than just suffered through. But I ask you to suspend your disbelief in improvement long enough to indulge our two extremist world improvers sitting to my right. Warren Mosler, immediately to my right, tells me that he is best thought of as a 40-year insider in monetary operations. He began in banking in 1973 and likes to say he grew up on the money desk at Bankers Trust in the mid-70s. After founding and managing the fixed income arbitrage desk at William Blair & Co. in Chicago, for 4 years he co-founded two more funds, and today makes his contribution from somewhere in the Caribbean. He can disclose the location later. Mosler co-authored Soft Currency Economics in 1993 after meeting Don Rumsfeld in the steam room at the Chicago Racket Club, where Don directed him to Art Laffer's firm, and from there he founded what was originally known as Mosler Economics. A few years later, somebody coined the term modern monetary theory, and that's how it led to become a school of economics. Robert Murphy, appropriately to the farther right, has a PhD in economics from New York University, which is kind of like Columbia, except it has a higher rate of piercings and lower SAT scores. After teaching for 3 years at Hillsdale, he left academia for the financial sector, moving to Nashville, Tennessee, to, oddly enough, work for Laffer Investments. He tells me there was no steam room encounter involved in getting him that position. Murphy is now the president of Consulting by RPM, where he specializes in economic analysis for lay audiences. He's the author of hundreds of articles and several books, including The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism and How Private Banking Really Works. I'm John Carney, the editor of CNBC's NetNet, our blog at CNBC about Wall Street. I'm tonight's moderator. Let's begin by asking Warren to answer the question, what policies does MMT offer to improve economic conditions?
Thank you, John. And I want to thank all the organizers and everyone for showing up. So let me just get right into the proposals, which say a lot about what I'm about. My first proposal is for a full payroll tax holiday, which means to suspend the FICA taxes that were actually allowed to increase at year end. I would have gone the other way and eliminated them. Okay. The second one is for a federally funded transition job, okay, which means the federal government would offer a transition job, and I'm just going to throw out a number, $10 an hour, to anyone willing and able to work. And the purpose of this job would be to assist in the transition from unemployment to private sector employment. I've got my healthcare proposal. I've got 8 minutes, so I'll go through it quickly, which has got me support from both the Tea Party and the far left. And that is where everyone gets $5,000, and again, the numbers are subject to discussion. Everyone gets $5,000 at the beginning of the year from the government for their health care, $1,000 for preventative, $4,000 for everything else. If you need more than $4,000, you're covered by Medicare for all. If you spend less than the $4,000, you get the difference back as a Christmas present at the end of the year, and your account is topped off $4,000 the next year. The $1,000 preventative, get your teeth cleaned, get your checkups. You don't get that topped off. You either use it or lose it. Okay. Fourth, I would make the zero rate policy permanent. I see no reason for the government subsidy of interest rates. I see it as counterproductive. I would just leave it as a permanent zero rate policy. And this is in the context of our current floating exchange rate policy. On a practical level, I'm categorically against the issuance of Treasury securities, but for all practical purposes, I would simply limit the Treasury to selling nothing longer than 3-month Treasury bills. Okay. I would remove the FDIC insurance cap. I don't see any reason for that once you understand the monetary operations and how the system works. And having a cap on FDIC insurance, all it does is tends to give the large banks a funding advantage over smaller banks, and more important, it feeds the entire money fund industry, which would otherwise not exist if the cap was unlimited. I would have the Fed provide unsecured bank liquidity, and we can get into that later if anybody wants to challenge it, but let me just say, the FDIC already examines the banks, examines all the bank assets, and if they're not up to snuff to federal regulations and they don't have sufficient capital, which is net worth, they're supposed to be shutting them down. The Fed lending to the banks is no different than you and I making a deposit in a bank. The FDIC has already examined their assets, and if the FDIC says they're okay, that should be good enough for the Fed. They shouldn't need to ask for additional collateral. And I would domestically source strategic inputs. I'm fine importing steel at the best price wherever in the world, but if we need it for our military, and we need it, and it's something we would need in time of war, that needs to be sourced domestically, so it would ensure the supply. And I'm covering a lot of areas here, as long as you give me 8 minutes. Campaign finance reform. Okay, it's one of my interesting proposals, I think. I would allow unlimited contributions to any candidate, except 60% goes to the candidate and 40% goes to the opposition. I think that would take all the problems of campaign finance out of politics. In terms of their energy policy, I think we need long-term contracts with Canada and Mexico to supply our oil needs. All commodities, major commodities, are done on a long-term contract basis. Only oil, you don't do it in the spot market. With oil, we've been doing the whole thing in the spot market and leveraging our economy to the spot price of oil, which to me makes no sense at all. And with that, I'm going to end my response to the first question as to what my proposals are. Thank you.
Bob, do you can respond to that, or yes? I'm just going to. We're sharing one pen at the table, so it's austerity.
Yeah, scarcity is real, despite what Warren's going to tell you. Okay, well, thanks everybody for showing up. I am going to do the opposite strategy from what Warren did. He fired through a bunch of specific policy proposals. I'm going to instead try to give you guys first a general framework within which Austrian economists like to think about economic issues, so then you'll get the few specific proposals that I'll say at the end of my remarks, and then during the course of the debate, and in respect to your Q&A, more specific things can come out. But I want you guys to understand, because I know some of you may not really know what Austrian economics even is, and so I want to give you that framework so that the things I say later, you'll at least understand where Austrians are coming from. Before I jump into that, let me just give a standard disclaimer here. Obviously, they picked us to be the representatives, Warren, of what's called MMT, me of what's called Austrian economics, but the people in these camps are very argumentative, and they're very strident online, and so if either of us loses this debate, I assure you our respective camps will deny that we represent them, and they will say, no, he screwed it up. What that moron should have said was such and such, and just obliterated the other guy. So now that I've taken the pressure off us, we don't have to worry about letting the fans down. Let me just, let's have a little fun. Okay, so first of all, what's Austrian economics? It's not that we study the GDP of Vienna. What it is, it's just a name that historically came from the fact that the people who founded this school of thought were from Austria. And actually, originally, it was a term sort of to put them down, because it was German scholars who were saying, oh, that's Austrian economics, because at the time, you know, the late 1800s, Germany was the intellectual and cultural center, and Austria was a backwater. So that's where the term came from, but as so often happens, these things, the term stuck, and so now it's a badge of honor that we're Austrian economists, when in fact, it's centered in the United States, where most of the so-called Austrian economists are Americans, but it is a worldwide movement at this point. Just very briefly, what the Austrians stand for, they think that economic explanation should be centered in the individual. So yes, Austrians do have very specific and strong things to say about the business cycle, for example, and that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the remainder of my remarks, but they don't look at things typically in terms of aggregates. They try to break it down in terms of micro things, and most Austrians think if you can't explain something ultimately by reference to the incentives guiding individual behavior, and to be able to build up that macro outcome by reference to the individual constituents, that we as economists don't really understand what's going on. They also tend to be very free market in terms of their perspective and their policy recommendations, but strictly speaking, Austrian economics is a scientific, value-free discipline. It's just that given the way Austrians think the world works, if you want there to be a reduction in poverty, if you want to avoid the business cycle, if you don't want there to be crippling price inflation, then the Austrians say, these conclusions follow, right? But strictly speaking, Austrian economics is not libertarian political theory packaged up as economics. It's just saying that given the value judgments that most people have, if the world works the way Austrian economics does, then these are the obvious recommendations that would spit out the other end. Okay, so as far as the issue for tonight's debate about what should the government and the Federal Reserve be doing, because that's really what we have in mind when we say what policies. We don't typically mean what should Ford Motor Company be doing. People mean when they say what should be done, they mean what should the government do, or what should Ben Bernanke be doing. To understand where most Austrians are coming from on that question, I need to give you an idea of what the Austrians think happens in the typical business cycle. So the first point to make is the Austrians, they are very concerned about government not interfering with freely set market prices, that they think market prices have a definite job to do. They communicate information. And so just like it would be counterproductive if the government came in and all of a sudden banned the use of cell phones when there was a natural disaster, for example, because, well, that would cripple the recovery effort if all of a sudden people couldn't use their cell phones. By the same token, Austrians are going to say if there's a natural disaster and prices on bottled water and generators and gasoline, if they're supposed to go through the roof in terms of supply and demand, the government should let that happen. That it's not the price per se that's causing the shortage. The price is just communicating what really happened. All right. Now, in particular, the Austrians, what makes them different from most other schools of thought, even other nominally free market schools like the Chicago economists, Milton Friedman, guys like that, the Austrians have a very particular view of what it is that interest rates do. So the Austrians can look, the interest rate is a price. In that respect, it's like other prices. It communicates information about the real world. It's not an arbitrary number. It really means something. And if the market interest rate is supposed to be 7%, and the Federal Reserve comes in and makes it 0.25%, that's going to screw things up. Right? Just to give you an analogy, most economists would agree that if the government came in and somehow made the current price of crude oil 25 cents a barrel, that actually wouldn't be doing people any favors, right? And even putting aside issues about climate change. If you want to pick something else, like the price of steel. If the government came in and made the price of steel artificially cheap, 1% of its historical normal value, most economists, not just Austrians, would agree that would screw things up because that's not the right price. It's not communicating the genuine scarcity of this particular commodity, and so the market can't allocate it properly. So what is it now that happens if interest rates are artificially low? So here, the standard Austrian story is it causes an unsustainable boom. So I don't have too much time here, so I can't dwell on this too long, but let me just give you the gist of the story as to what the Austrians think happened with the financial crisis, the housing bubble, and why we were in the situation we were in 2008. So the Austrians are going to go back, and they're going to say, let's go back at least to the late 90s when there was the dot-com bubble. They're going to say that was not just because of crazy, laissez-faire, unregulated capitalism. They're going to say that was because of the Greenspan Fed keeping rates artificially low, and there were other things going on too, but they said that was a necessary condition of that. And so the NASDAQ internet stocks in particular were pushed up way above what they should have been. There was a bubble that burst 2000, 2001. It was exacerbated by the 9/11 attacks. And the U.S. economy should have had a really bad recession. And people at the time were saying this is going to be bad. I mean, like more than $1 trillion gets wiped out in terms of wealth on people's balance sheets and so forth. Okay, and everyone's bracing for a really bad recession. And then Greenspan comes into the rescue, brings interest rates down, and people are calling him the maestro. And people are stunned that, wow, look at this. We're having a recovery. This is a recession where home prices they're continue to going up. And people are amazed. They're literally calling him the maestro for a few years there. Everyone's talking about what a genius Greenspan is. But then, in retrospect, a lot of people, not just Austrians, are going to say, what Greenspan really did, he didn't save us. He just replaced the collapsing dot-com bubble with a housing bubble. And that bought us a few years of false prosperity, made people think that he had solved the problems when he metaphorically papered over them in terms of paper money, but I say metaphorically because it's mostly electronic at this point. All right, so now, again, a lot of this we can settle in the Q&A, and you can press me for details if you don't like that story, but suppose that's true. Suppose it's true that Greenspan really didn't do the economy any favors. He didn't spare us, he didn't give us a soft landing like the way that standard textbooks say. Well, oh, gee, if the economy's sluggish, the Fed's supposed to cut interest rates, and that provides a soft landing. And so what if that's not true? What if all that did was postpone the necessary adjustments in real resources, and then the crisis that hit ultimately in 2008, that was far worse than what would have happened in the early 2000s. So in other words, in 2008, the idea that, oh man, imagine if we just had a collapsing NASDAQ bubble, that would have been a walk in the park compared to major investment banks going down in 2008. So what the Austrians say is, what Bernanke has done makes what Greenspan did look like child's play, right? Bernanke has pumped in more money than all previous Fed chairs times 2. And instead of bringing interest rates down to 1% and holding there for a year, which is what Greenspan did, Bernanke brought them down to basically 0, held them there for several years, and is promising to do it indefinitely until it finally starts working. All right, so if you think interest rates serve some sort of function, if you think they communicate information and that pushing them down messes things up, then what Bernanke's doing is really bad. And so a lot of Austrians think, yeah, it spared us the immediate crisis that, yes, would have happened in late 2008, first half of 2009, had the Fed and the government just stood back and let things unravel. But it's not sparing us the agony. It's just postponing it so that we don't know when it's going to hit. But at some point, there is going to be a reckoning, because you don't cause genuine prosperity by printing money and giving it to rich investment bankers who made bad investment decisions, which is what basically Bernanke's been doing. Okay, let me...
I think we've gone about 10 minutes now, so I was going to let Warren have a response, and then you can get your sort of the part 2 of policy recommendations in the response to that.
Okay, so let me just start. I took a few notes here because I had no idea what order or what was going to happen. But anyway, so let's talk about interest rates. Let's just back up to the word interest rate. Well, what MMT recognizes is that interest rates mean 2 different things, depending on whether you're on a fixed exchange rate policy or a floating exchange rate policy. Is anybody in here a foreign exchange trader? Okay, there you go. Any foreign exchange trader, and correct me if I'm wrong, will tell you that if you go out and short forwards in the Hong Kong dollar, interest rates go up. Okay, but if you go out and short forwards in the Japanese yen like they just did, the yen goes down and interest rates, short-term rates, stay exactly the same. Okay? You've got 2 entirely different things going on in the monetary system when you have a fixed exchange rate policy versus a floating exchange rate policy. And so what I'd like to say is what Dr. Murphy was describing is arguably valid in a fixed exchange rate policy, which would be a gold standard or something like the Hong Kong dollar or the Argentine peso when it was fixed to the dollar. And in fact, if you look at the original authors of Austrian economics, they were all in the general context of fixed exchange rates. Not that they always believed in them and prescribed them, but that was the general context of what was happening, and that best described the way the world worked at that time. Today, we're in a whole different context. We're in a context of floating exchange rates, and it's just entirely different. And I, for one, have been looking very closely at interest rates and what they do, because having been in the markets for a long time, one thing you don't want to do is make bets based on ideology and just lose a lot of money. So you kind of look at what happens. So I can remember maybe 15 years ago or so, talking to a friend of mine in Australia, asking about how the mortgage market was. He said, well, rates are 17.5%, the market's still pretty good. I think if they put them up to 18, it's going to kill it. I said, okay. Then my next call was to somebody in Japan. How's the mortgage market? Well, you know, it's pretty slow right now. Rates are 3.5. I think if we bring them down to 3, it's going to get going. Right? And so here I'm thinking, all right, maybe interest rates don't have a lot to do with this. Let's take a harder look at what interest rates do. And if you look, again, in a floating exchange rate environment where banking is never reserve constrained, where in a fixed exchange rate environment, it's always reserve constrained, completely opposite. In a fixed exchange rate, you compete for money, fixed amount of reserves, and markets determine interest rates. In a floating exchange rate, the Federal Reserve, the government, has to determine an interest rate, or it just sits at 0, which has often happened during catastrophes and other times when the government's not doing its job to support rates. Funds rate just drops to 0 and sits there. Well, anyway, so I look and I go, well, for every dollar borrowed, there's a dollar saved. Okay, so when you shift rates, you're just shifting income between savers and borrowers. Well, that's okay. That's a political decision. You want to lower rates and move income from savers to borrowers. You know, that's fine. If the propensities to consume are substantially different between the two, you can have a macroeconomic outcome. Otherwise, you know, probably not. The present values are the same. But in addition, in today's world, the governments are net payers of interest, and a lot of interest. Okay, the debt to GDPs are very high. And so when you're lowering rates, you're actually lowering interest payments, and it's called the interest income channels. You're lowering the payment of interest from government to the private sector. Okay, when you lower the payment, the private sector has less income. When you raise interest rates, the private sector has more. Okay, and so when I look at it that way, that to me better explains history. Now, just to give a little bit of this history, we can look at any one of these. Let me know if I'm running out of time here.
Yeah, why don't we let
Go ahead.
Bob have a chance to respond.
So let me just wrap up the policy conclusion from the Austrian perspective then. I mean, I think you can get the gist of it. The Austrian recommendation then is to say, look, let market prices do their job. If the Fed has, in fact, encouraged an unsustainable boom by having artificially low interest rates, then the worst thing in the world to do is to push interest rates way down again and think, oh, we're going to have to deal with that and have a soft landing. You're just setting yourselves up for another boom and bust. And so the Fed shouldn't do so-called expansionary policy. Also, because resources are better deployed by private owners in the private sector, again, the worst thing you want to do in terms of the federal government, in terms of fiscal policy, is to run massive budget deficits when the economy is already on the ropes, that you're just taking more resources from the private sector when, you know, so running $1 trillion deficit would be bad with a healthy economy. It's really not a good thing to do in the beginning of 2009. All right, so that's the Austrian perspective typically on those sorts of things. And, you know, it's ironic that I'm focusing more on what the Keynesians said. I don't know exactly what Warren was saying throughout the blow-by-blow of the crisis, but the Keynesians' perspective typically was, okay, Obama comes in, passes the big stimulus, and then all of a sudden the economy's falling off a cliff, and they said, whew, it's a good thing we passed that stimulus because the economy is worse than we realized. All right, now, if they were right, then that's true. You know, in other words, if the stimulus did help, then it's a good thing they got that in there because the economy would have been that much worse. But, of course, from the Austrian perspective, you can see where we're coming from to say that's not a mystery, that's not shocking that when they sucked all that money in terms of extra government borrowing, that the economy all of a sudden got worse than people realized at the time. So that's the Austrian perspective. As far as his proposals, let me just give you an analogy. I think I got about 1 minute left in this segment of the reply here. Let me just give you an analogy. Obviously, we've got different people in here. Some of you have read his book inside and out. Some of you are very new to this. So let me just walk you through in terms of his perspective and where he's coming from. It's not that I think the stuff in his book is wrong necessarily, and some of it I actually agree with wholeheartedly, but a lot of the stuff that I think he's saying is technically correct, but it's very misleading, or even more to the point, somebody might erroneously conclude from what he says that's technically true something that's the wrong thing to do. So let me give you this analogy. There's a wife and a husband sitting at the table. They're looking at the family budget, and she's just like, you know what, honey, our expenses, we cut this, we cut that. I need to go take a second job. That's the only way we can make ends meet. And he has an epiphany. He goes, no. I'm just going to put on a ski mask and go down and start holding up liquor stores. You know, we're not constrained by our budget anymore. And she says, what, are you insane? You keep doing that. You push that too much, that policy, and you're going to end up in prison. And he goes, okay, you're right, but I just want us to focus on the real constraint here. It's not about our budget. It's about me going to prison. So let's just, at least now that we're thinking clearly about the things constraining our behavior and our spending. Okay, so is what the husband there said wrong? Well, technically, no. He's right. That really the ultimate thing stopping you from spending too much is that you go to prison if you're holding up liquor stores, not that you need to get a job and get income. But you can see how, in my mind, at best, he has provided a distraction, and at worst, he's going to justify more spending than they really can afford and do something that would be even worse than running up your credit card to go hold up liquor stores. So that's when I take Warren to be saying, Social Security's not in crisis, what are you kidding me? We just run the printing press, duh. That, to me, he's not helping, and in fact, if he's encouraging people to spend more, the politicians to spend more than they otherwise would, I actually think that's a very dangerous thing, and inflation is arguably a worse cure than even taxing, and we see where the money's coming and going.
Warren, I'm going to, we're up to the moderator's questions now, and my first question is going to be, are you robbing liquor stores? How do you respond?
Well, what we have to look at is the difference between the issuer and the user of anything. So I'm going to use an example of subway tokens. Am I dating myself? How long has it been since the city had subway tokens?
At least a decade.
That's when I used to live here, when I was at Bankers Trust. So did everybody remember how subway tokens worked? Yes, okay. And so if you go down to the train station and you bring somebody to New York, they say, oh, I see how it works. First, they collect the tokens and then they sell them. And I go, yeah, I know it looks like that, but no, really, they sell them first and then they collect them. Well, how do you know that? They're just going around and around. Well, you know that they're the issuer of the subway token where they sell them first and then they collect them. And if you look at the city can't collect its tokens until after it gets them out there. The issuer of anything can't collect anything until after it gets it out there. The rest of us, we can't use tokens until we have to buy them first, get them, exchange dollars for tokens before we can spend them. The city has to exchange tokens for dollars before they can collect them. Okay? Likewise, with the US dollar, the US government is the issuer of the US dollar in this sense. Now, I know there are all these definitions floating around. The dollars that can be used to pay taxes come only from the US government, or they're counterfeit. And technically speaking, a tax payment is a reserve drain on the bank. It's inside money. It's a debit to their reserve account. Only the Fed can add reserves that can then get debited, either directly or through an overdraft or through some other way. But because you're the issuer of the dollar, think of it, if you've got $1 in your pocket, how did it get there if it's not counterfeit? The government spent it. It came from the government. It can't come from anywhere else. And the government hasn't taxed it yet, or you wouldn't have it. Now, I know it's a little bit simplistic because there's government lending, but we're just trying to focus on this one point. All right, and so the point here is there's a dramatic difference between the issuer and the user. So if New York City owed me $5 million, I'd be a lot more worried about their ability to pay me than if they owed me 5 million subway tokens. All right, I'm pretty sure they'd be able to get me the tokens. Okay?
Warren, you should check out Metro cards because they, in some ways, make your point even better. You could ask, where does the city get the credits that it puts on your Metro cards for rides?
Right.
And the answer is it doesn't get them from anywhere.
Right. And you've got to get credits before you can ride.
Right. But the subway system doesn't need to obtain the credits from anybody.
Right. But neither can they debit your credits until after they've given them to you. So the user has to get the thing first before he can use it. That's all of us with dollars. That's the states, the corporations, individuals. We all have to get dollars to be able to spend or our checks bounce, exactly like Professor Murphy was saying. The government, on the other hand, is in the opposite position. It has to spend them first or lend them first before it can collect them. And the way they say it inside, the insiders say it, is you can't have a reserve drain without a reserve add. And in the old days, before all the excess reserves were there, when the Treasury was borrowing, the Fed was in doing repos. They got to add the reserves before they can subtract them. You got to spend first before you can collect. It's just point of logic.
Bob, what do you? I mean, do you want to respond to that? You know, a lot of Austrians would say
again,
that government spending is disastrous, but Warren's making the point that the government needs to spend for dollars to enter the system.
Well, I'm not.
Well, sorry.
Okay.
I'm saying it can't collect them until after
Right,
it spends
it cannot collect them until after it
it
spends.
spends them. And that's the difference. That's why a household gets in trouble, because they have to collect first before they can spend. The U.S. can't be in that position with a floating exchange rate currency. Now, in a gold standard, which was the context of the original Austrian writings, yes. If the government spends and doesn't tax, it runs out of gold with defaults, and the system's, you know, is in default, okay? And you wind up devaluing, and it's a disaster, which is what happened in Argentina, which happens in all of Russia in '98, all the fixed exchange rate blow-ups where the money was backed by reserves, and the government put themselves in a similar position where they have to collect first before they can spend. The European governments used to be in a position where Greece would spend drachma first and then collect it. They never had a solvency problem. They turned themselves into what are like U.S. states, where now they have to get euro before they can spend them. They got a major solvency problem. The European Central Bank spent €1 trillion last month or whenever it was. Nobody asked, where did you get it? Did you borrow it from China or did you tax it? All they did was credit their accounts in their books. Now, can excess spending, excess demand drive the
Wait,
price?
let's
Okay,
before you anticipate all his answers, let's try to.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I'll make a few points just on this one little issue. So first of all, John said to Warren, are you in favor of robbing liquor stores? And he didn't deny it. I just want to, and it could have been oversight, but I just want as a point of order in the debate.
We have a Fifth Amendment.
Look, there's a lot we could get into, and this is really, I think, going to be the crux of it. So, and I have some questions that I'm going to bring up later in the debate when he and I talk to each other. So I'll say that as far as the analogy of the subway tokens, let me, for one thing, if the government came in and monopolized subway provision, or they could do it with food also, and the government came in and said it's illegal for anyone else to buy or sell food unless you get these coupons from us, and he could walk through the logic there, and that would not be a good system. So by the same token, if at best I would say, if he's showing, look, given that the government's going to monopolize the supply of money, all of my things follow, I would say still that's not a good system, because I don't think the government should be in the business of producing money. Right?
Okay.
Most of us agree the government shouldn't be producing cars,
Right.
because for 19 different reasons of why that'd be awful. Well, why would we let the government produce the money, which is the most important commodity?
Okay, so I agree then. So
okay.
let's add one more point.
Sure.
Now, you talked about deficits, borrowing, government borrowing, taking money out of the economy. Okay, that again is true with a fixed exchange rate where you've got your reserve constraint. But when you're in our system today, if you got to borrow $50,000 to buy a car, there's not somebody else out there who now can't buy a car because you took his $50,000. Loans create deposits. It's assets and liabilities and match pairs. And it's the same thing with government borrowing. Okay, the loan creates the deposit. I can.
Let me just ask.
So anyway, it adds to the number of dollar deposits in the economy. It doesn't subtract from them.
The Austrians stress, this is for Warren, interest rates as a guide for businesses in economic planning.
Yeah.
You want the government to adopt ZERP forever. Are you not concerned that the capital misallocation that drives a lot of Austrians to worry about government setting interest rates?
Well, I think we're both driven by the same thing, and I'm looking at it from a floating exchange rate, non-convertible currency context. They're looking from a fixed exchange rate context. I would never say that in a fixed exchange rate market, but I would in a floating, and here's why. When what is government interference in the interest rate market? It takes two forms. It takes the form of the Treasury issuing securities and the Fed paying interest on reserves. Okay? If the Treasury does not issue securities, which is a interference in the interest rate market, and if the Fed does not pay interest on reserves, then you have a zero interest rate. So the zero interest rate is the condition in a floating exchange rate market. It's the condition of no government interference. Government interferes to push rates up above zero. So if rates are at 4, it's because the government pushed them to 4. And if they go to 6, it's because the government pushed them. It's not because there's some natural rate at 6. That would be in fixed exchange rates. You will have that natural rate because you have competition.
So do we have no natural rate right now?
In a floating exchange rate, look at subway tokens. What's the natural rate for those things? It's 0. Or Metro cards, you don't earn interest in more cards, what they call the own rate, on your extra rides. Okay?
Right.
The market can do whatever it wants. There's never going to be an interest rate on subway tokens unless the city comes in and says, we'll pay interest in more tokens at 5%. All of a sudden, they've created an interest rate floor above 0. So if you look at the U.S. dollar, there is no interest rate risk-free unless the government comes in and creates that floor.
So, Dr. Murphy, what is your how do you respond to that? I mean, is the concern over government pushing down interest rates just a hangover from commodity currencies and not applicable now, or is that part of the problem that the government has seized control of currency?
Okay, so yes, for one thing, even if it were true that everything that Warren is saying follows, if we start with the assumption that the Fed has such control over the banking system and the government is the issuer of our currency and that's legal tender for all debts and so forth, even if everything else he said followed, I would still say, okay, but I don't agree that that's a good system to set up in the first place. That why are we letting the government have such control over money and banking?
I don't necessarily agree either.
Okay, we're making progress in the debate. We'll try to get some clash perhaps in the second half. Yeah. Okay, but I don't agree, and maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, but to me, I mean, the price of steel, the fact that a certain amount of steel exchanges for so many units of tuna fish or what have you, that's a real thing. That number shouldn't be 0. It would mess it up if it were. The interest rate, the discount on the future, that's not some arbitrary thing.
What's the own rate for steel?
Well, it shouldn't be 0. That doesn't mean, otherwise a ton of steel today is the same thing as a ton of steel to be delivered in 2,000 years. And to me, that makes no sense. Right. And the market, someone building an apartment complex needs to know how much are resources today versus something not available in the future, and that's what the discount rate does.
If there's a steel monopolist setting price, the own rate is 0.
But this is a crucial point, meaning one of the things that an investor now wants to know, that somebody who wants to expand their business wants to have information about, is what will be the future consumption power of people. Under a commodities rate, under a fixed exchange rate or commodity currency, the interest rate is indicative of how much people are saving, and therefore how much currency they'll have to buy things in the future.
It's also the real rate, and it's the own rate. What's called, Marshall, the economist, a couple hundred years ago, a monopolist has 2 interest rates that it sets. One is the own rate, which is how the thing exchanges for itself. So if it's gold, how does gold exchange for itself? So if you're holding gold, the monopolist would have to pay an interest rate. Say, if you hold gold, we'll pay 10% more gold if you let me hold it for you. The other price a monopolist sets is how gold exchanges for other goods and services. So on the gold standard, the government's the monopolist. They set the price of gold to $35 an ounce, wherever it used to be.
Right.
The interest rate then becomes the own rate for gold. Because if they set the interest rate at 5 and you're holding the money, you have $100 or $35. A year later, you have enough dollars to buy 5% more gold than you had before. So the interest rate is how gold exchanges for itself when it's a commodity currency. How it exchanges for other goods and services is the $35 they put on it. They could have put $350 or whatever, okay, as a monopolist. So they always set 2 rates. Okay? How it exchanges for itself, which is the interest rate, and how it exchanges for itself, which is the own rate, and what we call the interest rate, and how it exchanges for other goods and services. Now, with the U.S. dollar today, how it exchanges for itself is still the interest rate, the own rate, and that's set by the Fed. Same. And the how it exchanges for other goods and services is a function of prices paid by government. So it's a simple case of monopoly, and it's just a simple point of
I mean,
logic.
so-
And a monopoly might not be the right way to do it, and you might have a better system, which I'd like to hear. But right now, we're talking about the U.S. today. How does it work?
Well, this reminds me, and I think this is an important point. Murray Rothbard once wrote that governments take control of the money supply when they find that their tax revenues are no longer enough to support their spending ambitions.
Yeah, but again,
I
fixed
think,
exchange
but
rate.
well, yeah, no. So in other words, they move from a fixed exchange rate to a to a floating exchange rate, in part to relieve themselves from revenue constraint.
Yeah.
And I guess I just wanted to see if both of you agree with that. I think you both do, right? That what's happened with fiat currency is the government has relieved itself of the burdens of revenue constraint.
Okay, I mean, it's. Go ahead.
But
I don't know who he's asking. But.
Well,
both of you, actually.
Well, I mean, I agree. They're moving in that direction, and that yes, part of why central governments establish central banks and then try to wanted to get away from the gold standard was to get rid of those fetters. But that is something I'm going to ask Warren.
Right. Well, let's move on to that section.
Okay.
I think I have a little bit of an answer
Okay.
here. There's always been this idea that the money, whatever that is supposed to be a store of value, which means an investment vehicle.
Right.
Okay, as opposed to a policy tool to promote output, win the war, whatever. Okay, and so we've got lots of investment vehicles. The currency doesn't necessarily need to be an investment vehicle. That's a political choice. But you wind up with the old bimetal problem, where if you try to make it do two things and you fix on one, you're not going to be able to do the other. If you do the other, you're not going to be able to do the first one. So they go on the gold standard to try and fix it as an investment vehicle so that you can, if you want to save for the future, you can actually just hold the money. You can hold the dollars or whatever, pay a real rate of interest or something. You don't have to pick an industry that's going to work and have something real produced from it or anything else. It's really a government subsidy, okay, to provide you for the future, which is somewhat contradictory. The same people who want the gold standard and an interest rate, a real interest rate, are the same people who don't want government providing annuities for everybody. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there.
One question related to that is, this is for Bob. The Austrian business cycle insists that capitalists are misled by artificially low interest rates into misallocating capital. But given what we've sort of agreed upon about how our current system works, shouldn't that be dead? Meaning, why would any rational businessman look at an interest rate set by the Federal Reserve and think that is indicative of the savings of the American people or the amount of some commodity being stored up, when we know that's not true?
Sure. So what John's talking about is in the classical expositions of canonical Austrian business cycle theory, the language that guys like Mises and Hayek would use is to say stuff like, when the government or the banks create credit artificially and push down interest rates, that gives the illusion that there's been more genuine saving than there really has, or that there's more capital goods than are really available, thus the unsustainable boom starts. And he's right. They do make it sound like the businessmen are fooled. And I think, strictly speaking, that's not necessary to the theory. It's the fact that prices do work, and there are incentives, and if you lower the price, that's going to cause people to borrow and invest more than they really ought to be doing. All right, and so yes, even if you had a whole population fully versed with Austrian business cycle theory,
They're not
it would
yet?
screw things. Right, we're getting there. One person at a time. But it would mess things up. Just like if the price of oil is supposed to be $100 a barrel and the government somehow makes it 40, that's going to screw things up. That's going to cause, dislocations in supply and demand.
Let's let you guys ask each other
I agree
questions.
that a monopolist like that, for example, OPEC does have, at the margin, they are the price setter of oil.
Right.
And that does cause excess capacity and whatnot. They've got 3-4 million barrels, 5 million barrels a day of excess capacity. And that does prevent market clearing and alters the market for crude oil. So anytime you've got a monopolist involved, you no longer have a competitive market. It's at the opposite end of the spectrum.
So we agreed ahead of time to let you guys here ask each other 3 questions each. Let's do them one at a time, and then you'll get a follow-up after that. Who wants to go first?
I thought we were going to flip a coin. So. All right, I'll
Where
go
would we
first.
get the coin from?
Right, $1 trillion platinum coin. Someone's got to spot me. All right. Okay, so I'm going to ask him.
Yes.
And then he's going to ask me.
Yep.
Okay. Everyone, we don't want to get confusing. Okay.
And then we'll go to audience questions.
All right, so
after that.
this one is more of a clarification. This is not a gotcha. My next two are going to be gotchas, just so you know. Okay, in page 21 from your 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds, is that the name?
Yes.
You say, yes, there can be and there are self-imposed constraints on spending put there by the Congress, ... These include debt ceiling rules, Treasury overdraft rules, and restrictions of the Fed buying securities from the Treasury. So, and I just want you to clarify, it seems to me that, strictly speaking, the government can't do what you're saying it can do. You're just saying, well, if the Congress just wouldn't be silly and have these arbitrary rules, there's nothing stopping them because it's fiat money. But strictly speaking, the government can't tomorrow just write a check for $100 billion without having the money there, because technically Bernanke could say, no, we're not going to approve that. Am I understanding you?
Yeah, and the budget constraints too. I mean, the military could go out and buy anything they want if Congress didn't say you can't. So there is, Congress sets the rules, Congress appropriates the spending, and they are constrained only by themselves.
Okay, that's all I want you.
Yeah, and nominal spending, not real spending, nominal spending.
Okay.
They can create a lot of inflation if they want to spend enough. If you look at the Weimar Republic, they were spending 5% of GDP every month on buying foreign exchange, selling their own currency, buying gold to pay war reparations. And they had a pretty good inflation going until the day the policy stopped, and then it went back to zero. So yes, you can certainly do that. But again, Congress's checks will not bounce unless they decide to bounce their own checks. They spend by ordering the Fed to credit a member bank account. And they authorize the Treasury to, instruct the Fed to credit a member bank account. And they give the Fed instructions, yes, you can do it under these circumstances, no under those. And most of it's left over from the gold standard. They're all vestigial things. If we talk about...
well, why don't you ask a question to, or do you want to ask your, why don't you ask a question to Bob?
So the question I have for Bob is, do you agree that if anything can go wrong, it will?
Because of Murphy?
I'm sorry. I couldn't help that.
Wouldn't be much of a law,
Yeah.
right?
No. The other question I had was, is it true that it was your great-great-grandfather who made the family fortune with the beds that pull down, or is that? No, okay.
Murphy bed.
Yeah, sorry.
Google it.
I just had to
He
get
is
that.
so old.
Okay. We were talking about Bernanke pumping in money. And when I see that, what I see quantitative easing happening, and I want you to tell me if I'm wrong here, is that the Fed goes in, decides to buy $40 billion worth of securities. They ask for offers. Prices gravitate to levels where the market is indifferent between having $40 billion of those securities and $40 billion in reserves. And when the Fed buys them, they debit the seller's securities account and credit the reserve account, both just two different dollar accounts on the books of the Fed. The dollar holdings of the private sector don't change. It's just that their holdings go from what you could call savings accounts at the Fed to checking accounts at the Fed. Okay, now, under a gold standard, those checking accounts were convertible into gold. If Bernanke had tried to do that back in the 30s, when he was, early 30s, which is where he wrote his dissertation on, it would have been a massive problem with people then cashing those in and taking the gold out. The purpose of the securities account was you can't get to the gold until those things mature. And with fixed exchange rates, that's the purpose of securities accounts. That's the function of securities accounts. But today, it doesn't do, that's gone. Okay, that distinction's gone. And so what I like to say is, what is the channel where what's called pumping in money, buying securities, debiting reserve accounts and securities accounts and crediting reserve accounts, how does that channel, what does that have to do with the economy? How does it, what's the problem? And doesn't that explain why 20 years of doing it in Japan has shown absolutely nothing? And certainly if you look at the macroeconomic data in the US, it hasn't done anything either apart from cause portfolio managers to shift things around because they're still thinking fixed exchange rate or whatever they're thinking or not thinking.
Okay. Well, for one thing, and part of the reason they're hosting this debate and choosing us is that both of us are sort of unorthodox thinkers, and so I'm not going to sit here and defend conventional open market operations.
Let me also add, you said printing, and you were talking about the Austrians,
right.
Not yourself. Printing, Bernanke's been printing dollars to hand out. I just don't see how that's handing anything out to anyone. You know, how it affects anything, anybody's getting anything handed out.
Just for clarification, meaning when the Fed buys a treasury and gives somebody dollars, your view is that this is an exchange of one federal government asset, for another.
Yeah,
or liability.
Yeah, a treasury is a dollar deposit at the Fed, and they take your $1 deposit at the Fed, and they give you a different dollar deposit at the Fed. And it's exchange of Fed liabilities, it's a private sector asset, Fed liability, but it's like if Bank of America decided to move your dollars from your savings to your checking.
Yeah, which they sort of do anyway.
How is that handing out money to anybody?
Right. Well,
okay. So the handing out, what I meant there, and that was a bit of a flourish, but because buying like mortgage-backed things that they drove up the price of assets, mortgage-backed securities and things like that the Fed was willing to take from investment banks, that had the Fed not intervened and done that, those banks all would have gone down. But now all of a sudden they're fine because the Fed was willing to be a backstop on those so-called toxic assets. So it wasn't literally handing out money, but it was like if someone bought my house for $1 billion, technically they exchanged $1 billion asset for another, but my house wouldn't have been worth $1 billion had Bernanke not done that.
Okay, so you're saying they were paying above market prices?
For those things, yeah.
For which?
The mortgage-backed securities, well, in the treasuries too. I don't think treasury prices would be what they were.
The mortgage-backed securities were federally guaranteed. They were agency securities. They were.
But they were at the time trading below what the Fed. One of the purposes of the Fed's, and it was actually not necessarily the Fed QE policy, but the Treasury's earlier policy of buying some of these assets. They were paying above where they were trading at the time.
If they were, there was some premium they were doing, but it wasn't the whole purchase.
Right.
They paid an extra 5 points or something, but I think most of the evidence shows the opposite, but that doesn't matter. The idea that they did it, okay, I can understand that point, but to be clear, it's only the increment they paid above market prices.
And so are you saying all those investment bankers, they were indifferent, like Bernanke didn't help them? That if he said, no, we're not doing any TELF, blah, 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 all that stuff, we're not doing anything with the discount windows, they would have been, okay, we don't care one way or the other. Like, he could have just done it with soup kitchens. It's just a coincidence he did it with really rich, influential investment bankers.
Okay, so we'd have to go through each program one at a time. You can't lump them all together because some of them were very different from others. What we're talking about is bank liquidity. And again, it's the difference between a fixed and a floating rate system. Now, we have FDIC insurance, which means that if you were to walk into the bank and make a deposit, it's guaranteed by the federal government. Okay, and so, what we realized back in 1934 is, the way I like to say it, is the liability side of banking is not the place for market discipline. You don't have people trying to decide whether to put their money in Bank of America or Citibank based on reading the balance sheet. It sounds like a good idea. You get the market deciding but you ask the 20 top Wall Street analysts, 10 of them will tell you one thing, the other 10 will tell you another. So on a practical level, it's proven entirely impossible and not a reliable thing to do.
Should banks be allowed to issue bonds at all? I mean, if we don't want market discipline through the liability side,
so instead,
should they issue bonds?
No, they should just be funded with deposits and liquidity from the Fed. And then what you do is you regulate the asset side and the capital side. And that's what we learned in 1933 when we shut down 4,000 of the 8,000 banks and reopened with proper deposit insurance. And the mistake they made in Europe was they went back and tried to run the banking system without credible deposit insurance. And it's like a Ponzi scheme. It works okay on the way up, but as soon as it works on the way down, the private sector is necessarily pro-cyclical. On the way up, it piles on, and on the way down, it pulls away. It makes the cycles worse.
Sorry,
okay? It amplifies the cycle.
Bob, you have
Go ahead.
Where are we?
I wanted to move on to your gotcha question. Sorry, we got a little off course.
Do I have two more or one more?
You have two more.
Okay. All right.
Good.
All right. So let me read, so this is from page 42, so I'm going to read something from his book, page 42, and then ask you if I could tweak it. All right, so...
There were some typos in there.
Okay. Because I think you should use the subjunctive. All right.
Warren, you're supposed to say the name of your book whenever anybody mentions it. It's a rule of authors.
Oh, the 7 deadly innocent frauds of economic policy.
Yeah, for people who haven't done it, or people online who are watching, it is worth reading just, because even though I disagree with it, I think it's interesting to think through. But anyway, so there's one part where he says, government deficits add to our saving to the penny. This is an accounting fact, ... For example, if the government deficit last year was $1 trillion, it means that the net increase in savings of financial assets for everyone else combined was exactly to the penny $1 trillion. Okay, so that, to me, that epitomizes, kind of thinking he's doing, and allegedly shows how crazy it is that we're wringing our hands over the budget deficit, and oh my gosh, where are we going to get the money? And it's, yes, that's true, but could I not, with equal validity, say, to the extent that Microsoft runs a deficit, the rest of the world minus Microsoft thereby accumulates financial assets. And couldn't I pick any entity?
Yes.
So why is it that there's something special about the government in that respect?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree, and that's an important point. Okay, and so first of all, we've had these people in Congress say the government deficit is taking away from our savings, and when you borrow money, it's not there. It's completely wrong. It adds to the savings to the penny, as Professor Murphy agreed. And everybody in the CBO will tell you that. After they're done deficit spending, the dollars are all back, plus the Treasury securities are there. Treasury securities are real financial assets, just like any other savings account. Okay, if Microsoft spends more than its income, which is what going into debt means, you spend more than your income, somebody else has that income. And that has the exact same effect. So if you look at the US in the late 90s, the private sector was deficit spending, just like you said, to the tune of something like 7% of GDP. It was huge. And that was what was driving the dot-com boom and everything else, the Y2K things. Remember, we all thought the planes were going to fall out of the sky, and we all needed new softwares to keep our television sets from blowing up. And so we had this enormous credit boom, and that was driving the economy. The problem is, the private sector, when the private sector does that, it's generally not sustainable. Okay, you can't go into debt that fast because it has to be supported by income, and it just collapsed. Okay, when Bush and the 7%, at the same time, the government was running a 2% surplus, so it was siphoning off 2% of that 7%, and that was a good thing to be running a surplus at that time. Okay, so when the private sector's deficit spending like crazy and threatening inflation, it's appropriate for the government to be doing the other way. Going the other way to moderate it. Now, as soon as the private sector could no longer go into debt, right after Bush took over and the whole thing collapsed, then if you want to sustain spending, not necessarily government spending, private sector spending, then the appropriate thing would be a fiscal adjustment, where the government would then be spending more than its income. And it could do this through a tax cut or a spending increase, depending on your politics. And at that time, can I tell a little anecdote?
Yep, sure, go ahead.
Okay. At that time, they had lowered interest rates to 1%. Nothing much was happening. There wasn't the borrowing binge that was happening. Bush was getting worried. It was 2003, and I was telling this exact story, and some friends of mine, I had a car company at the time, which I just sold, and on the board I had some General Motors people, Dave McClellan, was head of Corvette, and he said, you guys got to talk, you have to talk to Andy Card. Andy Card was chief of staff of the White House. Andy was a former GM executive with Dave and John Heinrichs and the other guys. And this guy, Bill Novak, set it up, and Elizabeth and I, my wife, would go to the West Wing to the White House and start explaining to Andy, and he's a quick study, explained why interest rates weren't working. For every dollar borrowed, there's a dollar saved. All you're doing is shifting it. Government's a net payer of interest. You've just dropped interest payments to the private sector. Japan's been doing it for 15 years at the time. That's why it doesn't work. And he goes, yeah, why would anybody think that's going to work? So he said, what do we have to do? And I explained about you need to make a fiscal adjustment. The private sector was doing the deficit spending. They're pro-cyclical. On the way up, they get carried away until they blow up. And on the way down, once things are going down, nobody's going to lend to the private sector. They can't expand when housing prices are falling. Try and get a mortgage when the price of your house is going down. It doesn't work. It works great when it's going up. It doesn't work when it's going down. It's up to the government to either cut taxes or increase spending. He said, how much do we have to do? I said, well, I think you got to get the deficit up to $700 billion, which at the time was a lot. It was something like 6% of GDP. He goes, we don't have much time, do we? I said, no. So he thanked us. I got a nice note. We left. After that, President Bush was asked about the deficit. He said, I don't look at numbers on a piece of paper. I look at jobs. They got through every possible tax cut they could. They spent money on everything he possibly could, prescription drugs. The right is still mad at these guys for what they did. By the third quarter, the deficit was $200 billion, annualizing at $800 billion. It was enough so that there was enough deficit spending to replace the spending lost by the private sector. And I don't know how much was tax cut and how much was spending increase. Maybe it was half of each, whatever. The economy started to do better, and it didn't cost him the election. So appreciate you letting me get that anecdote in.
Your introductory remarks were shorter than time, so I'll give you a little bit of room to run here. But you want to ask your third?
Okay. One more. So let me just give you a hypothetical scenario, and you tell me how you would respond to it. So there's this CEO in the 60 Minutes or somebody's doing this expose, and they get the guy on camera, and I think they got him good because they said, our auditors went in. He's a CEO of a major corporation, and they said, for decades, you have been telling your employees you've been taking out 10% from their paychecks to put aside to fund their pensions, and you've promised them specific payments. Our auditors came in and looked at your books, and we found you haven't been investing in outside assets. You've been mostly giving it as dividends to your shareholders to boost your stock prices, giving yourselves bonuses, and you're investing a little bit in a factory. And now, you're underfunded pension by about like $10 billion. What do you have to say for yourself before you go to prison? And he says, whoa, whoa, whoa. I've been reading Warren Mosler, and let me tell you something. For one, this is just a completely arbitrary thing. If the Congress would just let us print our own $100 bills, there would be no underfunded pension. This is all a fake crisis. Yeah. And in fact, because demand right now is insufficient, we would be doing the economy a favor if Congress would go ahead and just change these arbitrary rules which make it illegal for us to run the color copier and print off $100 bills. That's a completely arbitrary thing. Right. How come the Treasury or the Fed can do it and we can't do it? That's stupid. It's not like, it has to be a piece of gold. It's just paper with symbols on it. If the Congress would just change this arcane rule saying that their money's good and ours isn't legal tender, all of a sudden this so-called underfunded pension disappears like that, and we create jobs. So there you go. Yeah. And of course, the 60 Minutes guy is floored.
I'd sentence that guy to 30 years in the electric chair.
Because why?
He's demanding the ability to counterfeit. Fine. He knows there's no counterfeiting allowed. I mean, that's, knows or should have known that you're not allowed to counterfeit money. He's committed fraud for his employees. He's a user of the currency. He can't spend it until after he gets it. He's not the issuer. And that's how the game is set up. You could be playing in a poker game and say, hey, this is not fair. Give me the deck and let me put any cards I want in my hand.
So the follow-up, I guess, that is if it's fraud when a person does it, why is it okay when the government does it?
Right. So let's say we're in a card game.
Right.
And I'm the scorekeeper. It's like, how many points do I have? I don't have any. All right. Well, then how do I give you 100 points? Well, I just write them down in your account. I write them down in your account. Okay. And then you lose. Do I have fewer points? No. And then somebody else has a bad hand and I take points away. Do I have more to give to the next person? No. Somebody in a card game says, well, that's not right. I should be able to just change my own score. Like, fine, you want to have a card game where people can change their own score? It's not going to work. It's not going to function. You're not going to be able to provision the government. The whole point of the monetary system, the initial point, or what I would say as a point of logic, the whole point, I know there are other points, lots of lobbyists have all kinds of points in their monetary, is to provision government. Okay? You want to be able to move people from the private sector, move real resources from the private sector to the public sector. People get together. I like these people who get together and say, hey, we hate government. We're just going to get together ourselves and agree to do this. Well, that is government, right? And so you start off and you say, we would like to have an army. We would like to have a legal system. Well, how do you get people to move from the private sector to the public sector? You could ask for volunteers. It doesn't really work all that well. It's been tried. The way that we do it, now they might come up with a better way, is you slap on a tax and something that nobody has, and then in order to get the funds to pay that tax, you've got to come to the government form, and that way the government can spend its otherwise worthless currency to provision itself. Now, the way I like to do that, to explain that, is I take out my business card here, and I ask, does anybody in this room want to buy? And this is called How to Turn Litter into Money. Does anybody want to buy one of these cards? They're $100? No? Okay. Does anybody want to stay afterwards and help vacuum the floor and clean the room? I'll give you my cards. No. Right. Oh, by the way, there's only one door out of here, and my guy is out there with a 9mm, and you can't get out here without one of these cards. Can you feel the pressure now? You are now unemployed. You are not, in terms of my cards, you are not unemployed before. You were not looking for a job that paid in my cards. Now you're looking for a job that pays my cards, or you're looking to buy them from somebody else who will take a job that pays in my cards.
Bob,
Okay.
do you want to? You could have one more rebuttal, and then we'll move to questions.
Sure. So let me
from the
just
audience.
clarify where I was going with that analogy in case it wasn't obvious is I think that's exactly what you say about Social Security. That he's, yeah, it's a phony crisis. You know, people on the right, Tea Party types might say the government's been spending that money. There is no trust fund. It's underfunded. But no, there's no constraint. They can just print off
Yeah,
the money.
there's no nominal crisis.
Okay.
It could be a real crisis if there's not enough food for the people, older people.
Right, okay.
If there's not enough housing, you can give them all the money you want. You can't buy what isn't there.
But my hypothetical CEO's response is analogous to what you think the guy running Social Security should say.
And again, the difference between the issuer of a currency and the user
Okay.
of a currency. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's government. You know, and I'm not saying that you can't come up with a better system.
And the last thing, there's no one out there with a 9mm. Just to be clear, right?
Yeah,
and
for our audience at
in
home,
which case,
there's
this
no
thing
way
goes
here.
from being money back to
'Cause
litter.
I hate vacuuming.
The difference between money and litter is whether there's the tax man. The guy with the 9mm is the tax man.
So
If
let's-
you can't enforce tax collection, the value of the dollar goes to zero.
Let's turn to audience questions. All right, I see one right
Oh,
there.
don't let Mike ask.
I don't know about anyone else here, but I'll be honest. Professor Murphy.
Oh, could you introduce yourself? Sorry, I should ask everybody. Please introduce yourself. Say who you are for our audience here and at home.
Mike Norman. I write a blog at Mike Norman Economics. I've been a member of 4 exchanges, been on Wall Street for 30 years in trading. Professor Murphy, frankly, I find a lot of your comments to be very condescending towards Warren. I don't know why you have to take that attitude. I think maybe you don't understand, or you said you don't like the fiat money system, which is, maybe it stems from that, just an anger against it. That's what we have, and you don't like it, and you speak up in a very condescending way, and I find that very distasteful and very disrespectful. I don't know how anyone else here feels, but I do. But the question I want to ask you, since you don't like the current system and you say the government shouldn't be the issuer of currency, what system do you like? Do you want to have a fixed quantity of money? Let me ask you something. Is that your system, a fixed quantity of money? That will probably take care of inflation and the non-printing of money. But in a world where population increases, where human beings strive to do better, where economies expand, and by the way, I think we gave up barter as a civilization thousands of years ago, and you need a unit of exchange. What about that? Is that what you're proposing, is a fixed quantity of money in the world?
Bob?
That's the solution?
No, I'm not proposing that. So first of all, I apologize if I came off as being disrespectful, trying to keep it light.
About robbing a bank? Okay.
Well,
Okay.
let's
No, listen, that was inappropriate, that's illegal, okay?
Okay, so let's go
Warren
ahead.
did say his guy
Let
was
me-
at
let me,
the door with a gun. So
Yeah, I mean,
let's let Bob answer.
by his own analogies, I mean, he is admitting that his system is predicated on people pointing guns, and that's why it's a monopoly.
Not my system.
Or
system.
the system. I'm sorry. You're right. The system. And so I think it is important to point out, and I don't think the fact, gold and silver, if it weren't for the government, in other words, the government did not create money. I think that emerged from spontaneous market forces, and the supply, even under the gold standard, it wasn't a fixed amount. There was more gold brought to the market, and if prices were too low in terms of relative to the weight of gold, then that would make it more profitable to mine more. And so there's Bitcoin, there's all sorts of things that would come out right now. So
The fact is, even under a gold standard, it became a multiple. It was a multiple.
Let him finish.
Let's we have a question right there, sir.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself. I learned my economics at Stanford back in the 40s, and it was Keynesian. And I was interested in your remark that both of you are unorthodox economists. I didn't realize that. I don't believe you were inappropriate in your remarks, but I do have a question. I didn't understand what you think is the solution to our problem today, which is unemployment, and has been for about 4 or 5 years, and was caused by an excess amount of private activity, speculation, borrowing money and using it. As Warren said, that the amount of money that was available, credit expansion was about 7% a year from 1971, from about $1 trillion in our country to about $50 trillion. Warren had laid out a number of things that his economic theory would do in order to get people back employed. And I just wanted to ask the question, how your system would do that, because that's really all that we're interested in, price stability and employment. How do we go about doing that?
Okay, sure. So I think one thing you do is the government should stop creating artificial booms and busts, because that's what causes the initial surge of unemployment in the first place. And so if the Austrian diagnosis of what happened is correct, then at the very least, don't push down interest rates to artificially low levels and set up another unsustainable boom and bust, because we're just going to be back in this position in a few years saying, what do we do about the high unemployment? I also, again, don't think that running massive budget deficits, that's good to encourage private sector hiring. All sorts of, I think, things that both Bush and Obama did in terms of regulatory changes and just changing property rights structures did have an effect of making businesses clam up and postpone hiring that they otherwise would have done. So I don't think there's one specific thing I can point to that caused it, but I do think that they have tried massive amounts of inflation and deficit spending over the last few years. And some people say, well, it wasn't enough, but just looking historically at what governments have done in response to other crises, I think what the major governments have done in the last handful of years, clearly it's not that they've been lacking in trying to inflate and run big deficits, and that's not working.
We're not censoring Warren, but we do want to give the microphone to the people in the audience, so when you ask the question, the people who are live streaming it. Yep, go ahead.
Okay. What? Yeah.
Can you wait a second?
You said that it was the government who created the volatility. And being on Wall Street for 50 years, I don't think it's the government. I think it's Wall Street and the bankers who got into a business they didn't understand and leveraged their capital, that is the people's capital that they got from deposits, in order to speculate. And I think that is what happened. And it wasn't the government going out and doing that, the private was doing it. So I wanted to ask you, am I wrong, or would you might be wrong by accusing the government of having created that volatility, as you just said?
Okay, so I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to clarify. So I am not saying, oh, everybody was lily white in the private sector and then the bad government came along and forced them to do naughty things. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a profit and loss system, and what we have right now is the worst of all possible worlds, where the government has all sorts of guarantees on the banking sector, has the implicit, Greenspan put and so forth, all those things in place, and then let people do whatever they wanted in the investment and commercial banking side. So that, I think, is a complete recipe for disaster. So what I would say is, don't subsidize the financial sector, and if they make really bad investments and it blows up in their face, you let them go down. You don't say, oh, they were too big to fail, that would ruin the economy. You let them go down and then say, okay, no one's going to do that again for another generation, as opposed to what they did in practice, which is bailing out a lot of those people, which just sets up a horrible moral hazard.
We've got a question all the way in the back there. Oh, yeah, sorry. Let Warren answer.
Just to be quick.
Then,
first of all, on too big to fail, as far as I'm concerned, the banks did fail. Their Citibank stock went from 60 to 2 or whatever. Some of the other stock shareholders went to 0. They got diluted out. That's what failure is in capitalism. It's the investor loses his money and somebody else takes over. The assets get sold to someone else. It doesn't mean the building gets bulldozed or anything like that, right? So nobody even challenges the idea that the banks actually did fail. Ask any shareholder of these banks. What's that? Oh, okay. Yeah. No, they should have taken losses also if the capital had gone negative. But normally the capital didn't go negative in most of the banks. And in fact, there was some serious scandals about the Fed transferring banks or the FDIC, below book value, right, and below actual market value of the capital. So I'm not sure that senior debtors got bailed out when the capital was negative. There was always some capital left, but if there was, I'm against it. I didn't like what was going on, by the way.
Go on.
Okay, gold standard, just quickly. I said before, it's the money as an investment vehicle or the money as a tool for the economy. The reason the gold standards failed and people went off and wasn't because they were working so well and everything was so great. It was because there were disasters going on in the countries. And in every country that goes into a war immediately suspends the gold standard. And why would you do that if it was so good for the economy? Because it's not. When you need the economy to go, you abandon gold and you just press on the economy. And then you lose the money's function as an investment vehicle. Well, it's a legitimate political choice whether you want the money to be an investment vehicle and be on a gold standard or just, have optimum output and employment.
Let's go to the question.
So, yeah.
So we're going to have time at the end for you guys to wrap up. So,
this question is for Professor Murphy. I think that one of the strongest assets of the Austrian school is capital theory. And von Bauwerk actually was the first one to kind of elaborate on that idea of the capital structure, that everything begins from, first when you mine the ore of, for example, when you create for example, a computer, you mine the ore of the computer, and then you create the computer chip, and then people assemble the computer like Dell Computers does, and then you have a consumption good. But for every person, a consumption good is something else, subjective value theory. So, for example, at one point, somebody might think of a good as a consumption good, another person as a capital good. Could you explain, in simple terms for people who don't understand, how when new money is created and how it destroys the capital structure, and only wealth is created when an innovative idea, entrepreneurial idea is introduced into the system, not when new money is injected into the economy?
Sure. So I think what he's getting at is the Austrians do stress the real capital structure and the importance of relative prices and the prime importance of the interest rate doing its job more than other schools of thought typically do. Look, we have a certain amount of resources, and they can be channeled into relatively short-term things like fancy restaurant meals, building movie theaters, building sports cars for people, or those same resources could get channeled into things that will not produce any tangible enjoyments for a long time. So they could get channeled into making research laboratories, drill presses, other sorts of 18-wheelers instead of making Ferraris. And so one of the and those are real resource trade-offs. That's not an arbitrary thing. And so the point is, when you inject money into the financial sector and that lowers interest rates, one of the effects, besides boosting aggregate demand or whatever aggregate thing you're going to look at, is it steers resources into more long-term things which might deviate from what people's preferences are, and that's where this unsustainable boom comes from. The economy really does hit a physical wall at some point, and you just can't keep pumping in more money to keep it going.
Do we have more questions from the audience?
Can I address that quickly?
Sure.
Okay, so I certainly agree with the crux of that, but let's look at the other thing is, and Austrians, of course, will tell you all about monopoly and how it restricts supply. So the way to look at it is the government is the money monopolist. And if it's not spending enough to cover the tax bill and the savings desire, okay, then it either needs to, I would say it either needs to cut taxes or increase spending, depending on your politics. Personally, my proposals now are for a tax cut, but that's not that there aren't appropriate spending things. But the thing is, if the government isn't spending enough, or if taxes are too high to allow for a given amount of government spending, if taxes are too high to not allow for the savings, which nominal savings, not real savings, nominal savings, which are required for all the unspent income that goes into pension funds and everything else, then the result is excess capacity, which we see as unemployment. Now, here's the analogy. You've got a runner who's a really good, strong runner. That's the economy. But the government's put this plastic bag over his head. Okay, and he's done it by not allowing, he's cut his air supply off. He's not giving him enough air to breathe and to, I guess you don't save air. Okay, he's cut him off. And so everybody says, and so when you remove the bag, okay, you're not adding stimulus, you're removing drag. The drag on the economy that's creating the high unemployment is the drag of fiscal policy that's too tight. So all these things that are named stimulus and give it a bad name, they're actually removing drag. And it's a question of whether you removed enough drag. So I fully agree that this runner, you can't get something for nothing. You can't pump money in and suddenly, you know, the peaches grow on the trees or whatever happens. It just can't happen. That's not how you do it. And adequate, you know, and the correct signals for the right capital expenditures are critical. Now, in a private sector, those signals come from sales prospects, and your ability to sell somebody on a business plan that someday is going to sell that product at a profit. Capitalism is driven by profits, which is driven by sales, and that's, you know, what's out there. Monopolists restricting supply puts a plastic bag over all that, and that's what's going on right now.
You can just bring the mic right over there. We'll, yeah, that's great.
My name is Yakov. I used to teach here, but now I work in finance. So I have a question as far as this restricting the supply of money. Now, let's suppose we have a floating currency. Let's suppose the sum of this currency in the economy is a million units, right? The amount of money in the system is kind of irrelevant. We can add 10 zeros to it and have a trillion, or a billion, and then we can add 3 more zeros and have a trillion. So the only thing important in an economy is the distribution of the money within the players in the economy. And so if what you're saying is true, is that there's not enough money, well, then we can say, well, tomorrow the government can just announce that we're going to add zeros to all the bills. And now we have a ton more money. But if we nominate everything in the economy, nothing changes. So what you're really saying when you're saying that you want to expand the amount of money in the economy is that you want to change the distribution of the money in the economy, and you want to distort past contracts. So meaning, right, in the past, let's say, I mean, imagine if all our bills got an extra zero, but all of our contracts stayed fixed. I mean, that would be a huge distortion within the economy.
Warren?
Right, so how do you explain the fact that you're changing the distribution of the money versus changing the amount of money?
How to explain this? So look, when I tell you guys you need one of these or else you can't get out the door, right? And there's 25 people in this room. There's 5,000 people. No, there's 25 people in this room. And I say, I'm only going to spend 24. Okay, I'm now restricting these things that you need to get out the room. This room is now in default. Somebody's not going to get one. Okay, when I first announced that there's a tax, you're all unemployed until I tell you how you can get the cards, the money, to be able to get out. And to the extent that some of you are going to want 2 or 3, it's going to be more than, the demand is going to be more than 25. The demand is going to be exactly enough to cover your need to pay the tax, plus however many you want to save and take home and give to the kids or keep them in case somebody else pulls this in some other classroom, whatever reason you want to save. There's a law that says their pre-tax money can go into your pension fund, whatever. Okay, so there's going to be a demand to pay taxes and to save and accumulate these cards. If I don't allow this room to somehow get enough to cover the tax bill and the amount you want to save, the result is a restriction of supply by me, the monopolist, and somebody standing here saying, please let me earn another card doing something, which is we call unemployment. There is no unemployment as we define it in a non-monetary society. It's always the demand, somebody looking for paid work in that currency. If there's 10 million people unemployed, I've got 10 million jobs in St. Croix, where I live, in the Virgin Islands, as long as they're able to work for no pay, right? It's about paid work. That's what unemployment's all about. And it's monopolists restricting supply. And the Austrians will agree that excess capacity is always the result of a monopolist restricting supply. Without it, market's clear, you don't get that. So why, once you recognize the currency is a monopoly, even if you don't like the idea that the currency is a monopoly, it is right now, the next logical step is that, okay, now that I understand the currency is a monopoly, that the monopolist is restricting supply, the monopolist is setting the own rate, monopoly's easy. When you learn economics, you know, monopoly takes about 15 minutes, and then you move on to oligopoly. And when you get that full competition, you got asymptotes and all that complicated stuff, it takes the rest of your life. The good news is, it's the easy one, it's the monopoly. Monopolist is price setter, not price taker, okay? Go ahead.
We've got to, yeah, let's take one up front here. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, just where you're going, that's fine.
So this question is for Mr. Mosler. If you believe that we have a monopolist restricting the money supply,
Yeah.
wouldn't, and you're saying that
Yeah.
we're restricting it by putting a plastic bag on the head of a runner, wouldn't falling prices also provide that, to use a different example, the lubricant you require, which a non-monopoly on money would provide?
Okay, no, the answer is when there's a monopolist restricting supply, the markets won't clear. So if I say there's 25 of you and I'm only going to let you earn 20 cards, the price of the card starts going up, the value, and you get your deflation, whatever you want to call it, the value of the money going up, right? And so people are willing to work more and more hours for the cards, and the market will never clear. There will never be enough to cover the tax. It's just that the system's in default.
Right there.
And that's true with any monopoly.
Hi, I'm Stephen Weiss, and my question is for Professor Murphy, and it's, who is your bad guy and why is he the bad guy? Because if I were to review your various points, you say inflation is the bad guy, or that the business cycle as it's been under fiat currency is the bad guy, or that delaying pain under Greenspan is the bad guy. And in all of those cases, moderate inflation, a business cycle that's normalized relative to what was under the gold standard, or delaying the severe cuts that could come with any recession. Those are overall outcomes that favor people who have fewer assets rather than those that have more. And to the degree that you're saying that your economic outlook or your monetary outlook doesn't specifically support a given political ideology, I'm wondering in what way an Austrian economics policy can support the kind of liberal democracy that we have in the United States while being internally consistent.
Okay, let me just push back a little bit on what you just said. If my diagnosis of what causes the business cycle is correct, then that means there are millions of young people right now, especially out of work, who basically their whole livelihood, their career prospects have been destroyed because of favors given to politically connected rich people. So, it sounds like you're saying I'm the guy, the heartless guy who's not in favor of the poor, but assuming my economic analysis is correct and they followed my policy prescriptions, we would avoid these massive boom-bust cycles, and you wouldn't have millions of people out of work.
Well, we know that deflation cycles were far more common and severe under a gold standard than they have been since the fiat currency.
I don't think, it depends what you mean by severe, but certainly the Great Depression, the U.S. went off the gold standard. What we have right now, people are saying, is the second worst thing in modern economic history. This clearly is not the fault of the laissez-faire gold standard.
We've got to move on to a couple more questions, because they're all the way over here. He's had his hand up for a long time, and then we'll come up to you. And then I have a couple that I got from the internet and Twitter while this is going on, and then we should wrap up.
I would normally speak with a loud voice, but I'm totally hoarse. Part of what strikes me is that you guys are actually arguing from two totally different standpoints, right? So I actually am an FX and rates trader, and I would agree with Mr. Mosler that what he is actually describing is the current rules, and they govern the behavior of interest rates, they govern the interaction of FX, and they largely explain most of the commodity price movements that we see. And so it's more a statement of fact of this is where we are today. And Professor Murphy, on the other hand, is describing the likely outcome of an unrestrained fiat currency, what Hayek would have referred to as the unintended consequences. And so, Mr. Mosler, when you talk about your proposals, you're ultimately saying, look, we should not feel that the government is bound by the possibility of default that would prohibit us from pursuing these, what strike me as reasonable policies. But ultimately, that's your individual perception. And so part of the question I ask is, one, understand that you guys are coming from two totally different perspectives. One stating where it is, and the other is stating the likely outcome. But the second is, Mr. Mosler, if you were to think about the likely outcome of behaviors under your system or the system as it exists today, would you come to a similar conclusion ultimately as Mr. Murphy?
Okay, so let me say two things. Number one, either you believe in representative government or you don't, right? and either you believe that that runs best with an informed electorate. So if there is no default risk, if we can't be the next Greece, do you think that the electorate does a better job knowing that or not knowing that? That's kind of what you're saying.
Well, just to
and
be...
and then what do I think is going to happen if they
yeah,
did know?
So just to be clear, I mean, we can end up as Greece, right? Ultimately, Greece made an uninformed decision in terms of its fiat prospects, but its population recognized that its government had proven incapable of managing their currency to enhance their standard of living, and as a result chose to join an economic union in which they gave up their sovereign rights.
Yeah, or you could say it was never popular to begin with, or you could say it was done under the misconception of what it would mean, because it's kind of like intuitive. It would be nice to have just one currency so we don't have to change our money every time we travel around, not knowing exactly what that means. So, okay, you know, I'll take that. But so if you look at the inflation risk, which is what people are looking at, right? You know, if people understood there was no default risk for a currency issuer, would they then have support representatives who just supported more and more nominal spending and drove up prices? I think right now the answer is no, because I think people dislike inflation more than they dislike unemployment. And right now, the Fed is talking about tapering and fighting, you know, worrying about future inflation when we have unemployment that's way above where, you know, where it's ever been, even during previous recessions. And nobody's up there marching in the streets against the Fed for taking this position. So I think the evidence in the United States, at least, is that people might err on the side of higher unemployment and lower inflation, even knowing that there was no solvency issue.
Can you pass the mic forward?
But, you know, that's just my observation of where the political debate is now. It all is, right? And so it's pretty hard to get any data points when the whole thing is just diabolically uninformed.
My question has to do with the predictive power of the schools of thought. I'm not familiar with your school of thought, to be perfectly honest. I'm not a trained economist. Back in like 05, 06, the Austrians were sort of raising red flags. Something's wrong here. Resources are being misallocated. You know, this is going to end badly. And they, you know, their book's been written, and I'm sure everyone's read those books. What were you saying with respect to your school of thought back in, you know, the mid-2000s, how we were going? Did you see this coming? Were you raising red flags?
Okay, so the answer there is yes and no. In 2006, I said that the budget deficit had gotten too small. It was down to 1% of GDP. It was no longer sufficiently large to support the credit structure, and we were going to see GDP flattening, going the other way until probably through the automatic stabilizers, the budget deficit would get high enough, would go back up to 5 or 6%. I did not see the subprime collapse per se, and let me tell you why. In the second quarter of 08, in 08 we had a flattening economy, we had zero growth, and Congress did a $170 billion stimulus program, taking the bag off the runner. They were just removing drag, right? And it worked. GDP was up to 2.5% that quarter, and I was there with my partner, Kareem Basta. He's a really good economist. And Kareem says, yeah, I'm worried about the next quarter. And I said, well, yeah, except they just did it, and it worked. They'll just do another one. I said, that's all they ever do is move from one stimulus program to another. And sure enough, things went bad the next quarter. And, you know, Kareem was there. I'm not so sure. And he was right. They did nothing. They just watched the whole thing collapse like we've never seen before. And nothing happened until the Obama fiscal adjustment came in. It was like almost a year later. It was March, wasn't it, of 09 before that finally hit. And they let the automatic stabilizers do the whole ugly thing all the way down. And I've just never seen anything like that. It didn't have to happen. In August 08, I was proposing a payroll tax holiday then, and named it the payroll tax holiday and started promoting it. If they'd done that, it wouldn't have happened. And then all the people who had forecast it was going to happen would have been wrong. So the problem with the forecasting is you're forecasting policy responses.
Let's go over here
rather than inevitable events.
We've got a couple questions there. Then that'll be it. We'll just go down the line, down to you guys. If you could keep them short, that would be great.
Yeah, hi. My name's Thompson Clark. I'm an equity analyst in New York. I guess my question to Bob really is if you could kind of clarify the Austrian position. Do we support, or does the Austrian school support a gold standard as the other side seems to advocate? And secondly, well, actually, we can just. Oh yeah, my second point was going back to the claim that without a Federal Reserve setting interest rate policies, there would be no interest rate, as in there would be no, decision of people to save versus spend, like Mr. Mosler advocated. I think that you said there wouldn't be an interest rate.
The risk-free rate would be 0.
Okay, it would be 0 if there was no central bank.
Remember, right after 9/11, it went to 0 for a while.
Yeah, well, yeah,
that was
but
just the government backing off.
I mean, never mind that history shows that the interest rate for thousands of years is right around 3%. I mean, I'm just speculating, but anyway. So back to the gold standard.
Okay, sure. Good question. So you're right. There is a distinction to be made between saying the most Austrians, I think, what they would actually say with regard to money is the government shouldn't be involved in it. Just like with cars, it's not that the Austrians say, oh, we favor a 4-wheel policy. That for most automobiles, we think the government should. Really what they mean is get the government out of the business. Now, if the government were running around enforcing a cartel of car makers that made vehicles with 3 wheels, then, as a loose figure of speech, the Austrians might say, that's stupid, they should have 4. But really what they mean is we think that with consumer preferences, blah, 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 if you let the market decide, they would be 4 wheels. So by the same token, Austrians don't want the government picking what the money is and supporting. No taxes. Right.
Can we pass the?
So I think there would be, the market would go naturally towards gold as being the market's choice of money if the government didn't get involved in that market and pick and choose. Historically, where the gold standard came from, though, was because people were using precious metals, and so the governments, to get people to use their currencies, pledged to redeem them in that, and many, it's true, Ludwig von Mises and other classical liberals liked that system because it was a constraint on inflation from the government's perspective. Just, it was a check on government abuse, the fact that, no, they have to redeem their money for a fixed weight of gold, just like they can't just lock somebody up without charging with a crime. That was the way Mises thought of it. He looked at the gold standard as like part of the Bill of Rights, the same class of thing, that it was a limit on what the government could do to you. You knew they couldn't wreck your currency if they had to maintain that convertibility into gold.
Let's go to the MMT hat.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering if there's government spending. If there's no taxing, are they spending? I mean, how is this working?
So again, we're getting into Austrian economics versus what political views do most Austrians have, and so. Okay. Many modern Austrian economists or people who like that school of thought do think that everything should be done in the voluntary private sector, and they think that a lot of the alleged horrors of what would happen if we didn't have government providing police and militaries actually would mean, well, there'd be fewer wars, there'd be fewer police beatings of people and so forth, and that free people can voluntarily solve a lot of those problems. And yeah, there'd be crazy things happening, but it might not be as crazy as World War, which is what happens when governments provide those services. But that's not all. Some Austrians are classical liberal night watchman state, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions to Dr. Murphy. First of all, my name is Raichu Markov. I maintain MMT blog in Bulgarian language for Bulgarian readers. And first of all, I would like to say that I agree with you, sir, that government which doesn't understand modern monetary system is very dangerous for everybody, for us. That's why I'm very scared now that at the moment there is even no one person in Congress or in our government, including our president, who understands it. Or if somebody understands, they at least don't show it, which is hypocrisy, which is even worse, I think. So my question is, I'm sorry, to Dr. Murphy, do you think that economy should work for the people or people should work for the economy? That's my first question.
Can we, just because we're running short on time.
I know, just one more and that's it.
Very quick.
And Dr. Murphy, do you admit that in floating exchange rate regime, the Fed sets the interest rates and not the market?
Okay, as far as the first question, I mean, I don't really know what it means to say would people work for an abstraction like the economy. Certainly, I think that the point of working is to make voluntary mutual beneficial exchanges and people earn an income that way. And you want an institutional system where you don't have mass unemployment. So I think that's what everybody in this discussion wants, and we're just disagreeing on how you'd get that. As far as the does the Fed set interest rates? Within reason they do, but ultimately the ultimate check is if people don't want to hold that currency. So yeah, the Fed could promise to keep interest rates low, but if people after a while, if they had to keep pumping in money and everyone just abandoned the dollar, that would be the ultimate constraint.
Next question. There. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Danny Panzer, just a casual follower of heterodox economists. Dr. Murphy, sorry to keep piling on, but I've got questions for you as well. I think Warren, and you can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing your views, I think Warren came out pretty strongly that he feels QE wasn't effective primarily because of the interest income channel, and that because the federal government is a net payer of interest, that when you lower rates, you remove money from the private sector. Do you agree with this view? And if not, what channel specifically do you think boosts aggregate demand when actions like QE are undertaken?
Well, again, and this is what I started to say, I think, in response to when he brought that up. I certainly am not sitting here defending quantitative easing and saying the standard, neo-Keynesian or neoclassical textbooks about the proper Fed policy are the right way to look at things. So I agree that what Bernanke has been doing, what the ECB has been doing is silly and counterproductive. It's just, I think we're disagreeing about why. As an Austrian, we don't think in terms of what do you do to juice aggregate demand. For us, it's more about relative prices. So to me, the problem is not right now, oh man, we need more spending. The problem is, for some reason, employers do not find it worthwhile to hire people, and so one way to say it is, why are nominal wage rates higher than what the employers think the marginal productivity would be? And so it's an issue of relative prices, and that issue, it's not, shoot, what do we do to get people to spend more?
This came up, I'm going to ask a couple quick questions that came up on Twitter while we were talking. One is, what policymakers are closest to each of your points of view, if any? Warren, are there any elected officials, or who do you think understands your point of view and is an advocate for it in the government?
I can't think of anybody. I'd be open. If somebody else knows of any, please let me know.
The only obvious one I would say, and he just retired, is Ron Paul. Obviously, was very well versed in Austrian economics, and my joke is that he was an OBGYN, and he really, he's not bluffing. He knows a lot more about economics than I know about delivering babies.
Another question that came in is, Warren, you said that we shouldn't depend on the liability side of banks as to regulate what kind of risks they take, but instead we should regulate the capital side through supervision.
And the asset side.
Right, and the asset side. We do. Right, and we've undertaken to do that. So the question is, from whence comes your confidence that we can do a good job of supervising the asset side of banks, especially given the near collapse of the financial system we just experienced?
Well, for one thing, you can't allow anything. You can't allow a bank to do anything that you can't regulate. So my proposal is severely narrow banking, even way beyond Glass-Steagall, to things that we actually can regulate, and then the rest can be out in the private sector. But we're talking about the public purpose of a payment system where people have depositories where they can pay their bills and write checks and not have to worry about it. It's an extension of the government's provisioning itself with taxation and being able to have payment system in U.S. dollars, for example, and for that you need insured deposits and you guarantee the liability side. On the asset side, you don't necessarily have to let banks lend anything, and so you've got to be very careful with it. You've got to make sure that this lending is serving public purpose, that somehow home lending by banks is serving public purpose, or you just don't do it. You
Okay.
certainly don't let them take financial assets as collateral and have interbank markets and
Right.
all these other things.
So you would advocate for a much narrower set of transactions that the banks are engaged in?
I got my first banking job in 1973. In 1972, with 200 million people, we had 2.6 million housing starts, okay? And it was all done by a bunch of dumb S&Ls, of which I worked for one of them. And I got paid $140 a week, and we played golf at 4 o'clock every day. And all we did was have savings deposits and made mortgages. Okay, we took in savings at 5, and we made mortgages at 8. 2.6 million housing starts for 200 million people. A few years ago, with the financial sector taking 30% of the S&P earnings, right? Is that what it was? Okay, 2 million housing starts with 300 million people was an unsustainable bubble. Right? Clearly, the financial sector is entirely parasitic, and we just let it get way out of hand. And it did more with less back then for obvious reasons.
Bob, what's your position on bank regulation? And should banks be set free from regulation, or should they be restrained?
I'm going to take I think probably the opposite approach of what he just said, or even earlier remarks as well. So again, going back to what I said, what we have now is a terrible combination where through FDIC and other more implicit mechanisms, bankers on commercial investment side are led to believe that they can invest in all sorts of things, and customers, certainly when you put your money in a checking account, you look at things like, where are their branch hours, how many ATMs do they have. You don't go and look at their balance sheet, or you don't look at their policies, and that's bad. You don't want people to be indifferent about what the banks do with the funds you entrust to them. And and Warren's comment that he wants to have a narrow banking sector and then have the rest of the activities out in the private sector. To me, no, banking, you don't want the government to be the financial intermediary. I mean, there's a legitimate function that banking serves about channeling savings into the proper investments, and that's not a proper role of the government.
Well, wait, and this is actually a great point to...
But I would leave that for private banking.
Well, I think this is a great point to move on to our conclusory remarks. Warren, you can go first. What have you learned tonight?
So, when Bob was talking about there's a problem with relative prices, he's talking about market clearing. There's some wage where you will get full employment, which is true in the absence of monopoly. I think he'll be the first to agree that with labor unions, that's not going to happen. You're going to get excess capacity, and the same thing is true when the currency is a public monopoly, or a monopoly. It happens to be a public monopoly, where when the monopolist restricts supply, you get excess capacity. You don't have market clearing, and that's what we're seeing today. And it doesn't matter if wages drop. You're still not going to get market clearing. You're just going to get lower wages, less spending. You've got the problem of, I'm taxing you guys 25 cards, and I'm only letting you earn 20. And you're going to have this downward spiral, and it's in default. And it can't work because it's a monopoly. Okay, and I can't emphasize that enough. And the Austrians agree that monopoly is the problem with markets, and they all the models assume competitive markets. And so all I'm asking is if they pick up the idea that the currency itself is a monopoly, apply that to their models, I think they'll get the same answers I do on all these things. Now, in terms of banking, what he just said, I actually agree. I'm narrowing banking so that people who just want to use the payment systems have public banks, government banks, public banks for public infrastructure where you can just write checks and do things. Private depositories can attract your deposits. You can read their balance statements. They can go out and make loans and do whatever they want. That's fine, okay? And what I'm going to talk about here is the idea that a financial crisis like we had in 2008 would not have even been noticed, like the crash of '87, if it hadn't spilled over into the real economy and caused unemployment and all the rest. And it doesn't have to be that way, okay? And the reason you get these booms and busts, I think, is something I started to talk about, which is that the private sector is pro-cyclical. They tend to move, they tend to make the upswings, they accelerate things in the upswings, and the private sector pulls back and makes the downswings worse, okay? And so that's just the nature of the private sector. And only the government sector can be there counter-cyclically. And it doesn't have to be there with more interference. It doesn't have to be there with any of these other things that people don't like about government. in terms of, and I want to get in a word about inflation. And just to give the principle first, when you've got a monopolist is price setter, not price taker. This means the price level is necessarily a function of prices paid by government when it spends and/or collateral demanded when it lends. I'm not, closing remarks, I can't go into detail on that, but it's like these cards. If I tell you you got to work an hour for one of them, they might exchange between you for $30 each. If I tell you you got to work 2 hours to get them, they might be $60 each. Okay? I'm the price setter. They're my cards. You need my cards to get out of your room. We need the government's money to pay the tax. The government decides the terms of exchange, whether it knows it or not. It doesn't know it, and so it tries to do all this market nonsense, but it doesn't know it. Okay, so let's see. Wrapping it all up, let's look at central banks and inflation. Okay, for 20 years, the Bank of Japan has been trying as hard as it can to create inflation and failed. Okay, that's a central bank with every tool available. Now you can say it's an exception and everything else, fine. The Fed has been trying as hard as it can for 5 years to create inflation. $85 billion a month in QE, and the numbers just came out Friday and today. It's failed, even in this last thing, okay? Maybe it's not that easy for a central bank to create inflation. Okay, everybody's acting like we're on this edge, and if one false move out of Bernanke or Bank of Japan or the European, and it's going to be hyperinflation. These guys are trying with throwing everything they can possibly think of, trying to create it and failing. Okay, there's more to it here. It's not that simple. And if you look at all the inflation cases, the actual ones, it's there are always extenuating circumstances that involved. Let me just say I want to thank everybody for this forum and for attending, and everybody out there listening on live stream. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Murphy.
4 minutes.
Yes, you get the penultimate word here.
Sure. Well, again, thanks to everyone for showing up and listening to this. Let me, if you take nothing else away from this, from my remarks, let me push back a little bit, because it's certainly a trump card that the fans of MMT play a lot, and they say, look, this is not the system we want there to be. We're just saying this is the way the world is, deal with it. But that's not correct, and that's why my first question when I asked Warren, I read to him from his book, on page 21, when he said, okay, yeah, right now there are self-imposed constraints, right? There are debt ceiling rules, Treasury overdraft rules, right? So since 1981, it's technically not true, right? The government has budgets. Since 1981, it is not true that the Treasury can just run it whatever check it wants and the Fed has to clear it. That's not been the case since 81. And the Fed right now is not legally allowed to just directly buy Treasury debt issued at auction. They have to go to the secondary market. Okay, so strictly speaking, right now, the government cannot do the sorts of things he's recommending. All right, he's saying there needs to be policy changes to do what I want. I mean, clearly, just think of it this way, clearly the world right now is not in accordance with what he wants, because otherwise, we'd have all these millions of people. That's not what he wants. So he's recommending policy changes to do these things. So it's not actually the case that he's just describing the way the world is, and then I'm over here saying, oh, but I wish the government would do such and such. No, we're both saying we wish the government should change what it's doing, and we have a difference of opinion about what that should be. So I think it's a false way of framing our respective positions to make it sound like he's objectively describing what is, and that I'm just pining for what I wish according to my strange value system. We're both describing things. So now, having said that, again, let me remind you, I brought up some analogies. Some of you liked them. Some people on this side of the room did not like them, okay? That we're saying, look, if any other entity did the sorts of things and then tried to justify them or just explain what they were doing the way in his writings he talks about what the government's doing, whether it's the household worrying about their financing, whether it's a CEO who's not contributing to the pension plan, if they defended what they were doing with the way that Professor Mosler is talking about the government with respect to its budget, with respect to Social Security and so forth, clearly that would be fraudulent. He said that guy should get the electric chair. I mean, he was possibly exaggerating just to make the point, but in the fundamental way that he came back and said there's a distinction here that you're not getting, Murphy, is that it's like there's a scorekeeper, and obviously there's a distinction between the people playing the game versus the referee setting up the game. But then that just begs the question, why are we playing this game in the first place? Why is that guy the scorekeeper according to his own analogy, it's because they have guns and are pointing them at us and saying, you're going to play this game. The reason this my business card is going to work is because you're going to get shot otherwise. All right. So since neither of us is describing the way the world literally is right this second, we're both explaining tweaks we want to make in this system. It seems to me that's kind of a big deal. That by his own admission, this system that we're currently in and he wants to tweak a little bit is one where it all rests on the fact that there's these guys with guns who set it up a certain way. Last point is he's saying, look at one way to think about it is the government has a monopoly on a certain thing. And he's saying, and I agree with that to some respects or not. And so then why don't we get rid of that, right? If the government right now, Soviet Union, if they had a monopoly on agricultural output, yeah, there'd be an economist in there who could, his career would be writing books about proper Soviet planning of government, agricultural targets and so forth. But surely you would think that the right thing to do for the economist would be to focus on let's change this system. So it's an awkward position where it's not even that I disagree so much with any particular thing that's in his writings, and and I think also in terms of what he might think in terms of if we were from scratch to design a system and what's the proper functions for government. We obviously disagree on some areas. We're actually not that far apart. I don't understand why he's focusing on certain things and just conceding, yes, the government's going to have a monopoly on money and so forth, and that's the way it is. And in that respect, go ahead and why are we worrying about them printing money and shifting the burden from raising taxes, budget constraints, to just, running the printing press?
Well, fortunately,
just operation.
Sure, go very quickly.
Just quickly, under current institutional arrangements, the U.S. government can run unlimited nominal deficits. It's got the primary dealer set up. The Treasury can sell unlimited amounts of Treasury securities exactly at the interest rate set by the Fed, and we don't need to make those kinds of institutional changes to run any size deficit we want to sustain full employment.
So fortunately, I'll say we don't have a monopoly scorekeeper. Instead, the scorekeeper is everybody who's here. But you guys have done a very good job of keeping the interest rate above zero, so I thank you for that. I think we are, just wanted to thank everybody who's watching, everybody who came out here. It was terrible weather. And for the millions of students who will watch this in history in the future, this historic moment, we thank you as well. So thank you, guys. I think there might be a couple closing announcements.
Just a few quick announcements. My name is Raul Carrillo, and I am a second-year law student here at Columbia Law School, and I am also a co-organizer of the Modern Money and Public Policy series. If we could just get a quick round of applause, please, for our moderator, John Carney. And for our speakers, Dr. Murphy and Warren Mosler. The video of this debate will be available on modernmoneyandpublicpurpose.com, and then you can also follow us on Twitter at The Public Money. Thank you.
We had microphone deflation.
You're one of those $100 cards?
We have
microphone
deflation.
Yeah.